Four friends, John, Mike, Tony, and Dave, decided to spend a quiet weekend fishing at the Vermillion River in Hastings, Minnesota. The spot was deep within the woods, far from the town's bustling streets, a perfect escape from their daily lives. The river was known for its serene beauty, a place where time seemed to stand still. They arrived in the early afternoon, the sun filtering through the dense canopy of trees. The river flowed gently, its surface glistening in the light. The men set up their gear along the riverbank, casting their lines into the water and settling in for what they hoped would be a peaceful day. As the hours passed, they fell into a comfortable rhythm, the silence between them broken only by the occasional joke or the sound of a fish breaking the surface. But as the sun began to set, the atmosphere around them shifted. The air grew colder, and the woods, once alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, became eerily quiet. "Feels like the temperature just dropped 20 degrees, John remarked, rubbing his arms for warmth. "Yeah, it's getting weird out here," Mike replied, glancing uneasily at the darkening woods. Just as they started to consider packing up, they heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it was almost indistinguishable from the wind. The men exchanged confused looks. "Did one of you say something?" Tony asked, his voice low. "No," Dave said, straining to listen. "But I heard it too." The whisper came again, this time clearer, but they couldn't make out the words. It seemed to be coming from all around them, carried on the breeze, impossible to pinpoint. "Maybe it's the wind through the trees," John suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. They tried to shrug it off, focusing on their fishing, but the whisper persisted. It grew louder, more insistent, almost like someone was trying to speak to them but just out of reach. Then, in the midst of the unnerving sounds, they heard their names, soft, drawn out, and distorted, as if being spoken by something not entirely human. John. Mike. Tony. Dave. The voice seemed to echo in their minds, making their skin crawl. "Who's out there?" Mike called, his voice betraying a nervous edge. But there was no response, only the eerie whispering, now closer, more distinct. The voice mimicked their own words, repeating them back in a mocking tone. Every time they spoke, the whisper echoed their sentences, blending their names into the chilling chorus. The men were on edge, their usual banter replaced by uneasy silence. Then, out of nowhere, small stones began to plink into the water around them, creating ripples that spread across the river. They looked around, trying to see where the stones were coming from, but the woods were still, and there was no sign of anyone nearby. "What the hell is going on?" Tony whispered, fear creeping into his voice. No one had an answer. The whispering grew louder, more frenzied, swirling around them as if the woods themselves were alive with voices. They began to hastily pack up their gear, eager to leave before whatever was out there decided to show itself. Just as they were about to leave, they noticed the fish they had caught lying lifeless in their cooler, their earlier excitement forgotten. As they gathered their things, they heard the sound of something scraping across the ground behind them. Turning around, they saw nothing, but the cooler had shifted, and the lid was slightly ajar. One by one, the fish began to slide out of the cooler and back into the river, as if pulled by an invisible hand. The water splashed as each fish disappeared beneath the surface, leaving the men stunned and speechless. "Did you see that?" Dave whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. Before anyone could respond, the whispering returned, this time so close it felt as if it was right next to them, breathing down their necks. "Go, leave." That was all they needed to hear. Abandoning whatever gear they hadn't yet packed, they scrambled through the darkening woods, tripping over roots and stumbling in their haste to escape the unseen presence that seemed to be chasing them. As they finally reached their car and sped away, the whispering faded, but the memory of it lingered, haunting them. Even as they left the woods behind, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something that didn't want them there. None of them spoke of that night again, but in the quiet moments when they were alone, they could still hear the faint whispers, a reminder of the terror they encountered at the Vermillion River.